Trials and Triumphs, a program that takes a hard look at the hard topics with Pastor Ladena Bough.
The views and opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenter and may not be the same as MTM Broadcasting or its affiliates.
Good morning. I'm Ladena Bough from Stockton, Missouri, and you're listening to Trials and Triumphs. I thank you again for tuning in. I wanted to discuss this week violence perpetrated by transgender individuals, but then get into the fact of transgender suicide. As I said last week, the increase in mass shootings by gender-confused individuals is sparking worry over the volatile cocktail of mental health issues and body-altering chemicals. The disproportionate tendency for extreme violence may be explained by biology. According to neuropsychologist Alan Hopewell, some people think that changing their bodies to reflect their new gender identity will solve their mental health problems, so many people with gender dysphoria may try hormone treatments first, which in fact makes them more susceptible to mood swings and health problems. Patients trying to live as the opposite sex take massive doses of testosterone or estrogen. Treatments meant to try to alter gender also disrupt brain function and the entire physical system of the body. A systemic review of the effects of testosterone given to women who identify as men was released in 2020. It examined 7 different studies on aggression levels before and after taking male hormones in people who identify as transgender. In their analysis, researchers wrote that women trying to live as men are warned of increasing aggression when initiating testosterone therapy because of past associations between male hormones and aggression. Testosterone has been connected to what is known as roid rage, unwarranted rage or angry outbursts often associated with the use of steroids. Testosterone abuse in weightlifting and bodybuilding circles brought attention to the issue when a law against steroid use was passed in 1990. I've read many accounts of pro wrestlers and other athletic individuals that killed their entire family as a result of steroid use. Transgender patients often suffer from other mental issues such as autism, depression, and anxiety. Mr. Hopewell had said that, He added that he had seen that administering hormones to a person already under mental stress can worsen mental health issues. A recent Finnish study found that mental health issues for people who medically transitioned continued despite that treatment. An analysis of data showed that the need for psychiatric care was greater both before and after medical transitioning, compared with the need for psychiatric care of people in the study control group. That's from an article called Growing Concerns Over Links Between Transgenderism and Violence. Individuals who transition present with many more common psychiatric needs than do their matched population controls, even when medical gender reassignment interventions are carried out, the study researchers wrote. When treating patients with gender dysphoria, many in the medical community seem committed to affirming a patient's desire to change genders, according to Andrew Brown, Associate Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and that, he said, is causing immense suffering in patients. Quoting, "These kids who are struggling with gender dysphoria, they are in pain. They are experiencing a real mental health issue, and they need counseling and mental health treatment. They do not need medicalization," unquote. But the trend is for doctors and psychologists to affirm a patient's belief that he or she is born in the wrong body and that a medical transition will make things better. That, Dr. Hopewell said, only furthers the pain that these individuals are experiencing. And when they find they are still suffering with mental health issues, they often eventually pursue more radical steps. That may involve removing genitals or having surgery to add what resembles genitals of the opposite sex. When surgical measures do not help them feel less confusion or discomfort, their mental health issues are worsened with feelings of more anger and a sense of isolation and alienation. And what happens is they get to the end of the road where there is nothing else that can be done. They come to the realization then that I'm just as mentally ill as I've ever been, and I'll never be a real woman or a real man. Experts say that the increase in killers who are gender confused certainly deserves scrutiny. Mr. Brown, the Associate Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, said he is not surprised that there is a disproportionate number of shootings committed by people who identify as transgender. People with gender dysphoria are struggling with a state of distress or unhappiness caused by feeling that their gender identity does not match their sex. They often say they were born in the wrong body and their true gender does not represent the sex they were assigned at birth. Again, I tell you, you were not assigned a gender at birth or sex at birth, other than the fact that God made you male and female. The doctor holds you up and you've got the body parts to prove that, okay? That mental health challenge can be worsened by the violent rhetoric of some transgender activists. I quote, "It's not a far leap for those two things to come together and really create this perfect storm of factors that can lead to violence," unquote. Despite some studies that show it is not true, many fighting to make transitioning children legal in all 50 states claim that helping children transition to another gender can reduce the chance that those with gender dysphoria will commit suicide. Some say that studies have been inconclusive on whether suicidal thoughts or attempts at suicide are reduced with the use of cross-sex hormones and gender-altering surgery. A 2023 review of studies looked at the risk of suicide following gender-affirming hormone administration and surgery showed a decrease. However, some of the studies relied on less objective surveys, leading the reviewers to conclude that more objective scientific studies were needed. I cannot agree with that more fully. We've talked extensively about the lie, do you want a live daughter, a live son, or a dead daughter? At the present time, activists in the United Kingdom are in an uproar that wrong sex-identified people are dying due to the recent puberty blocker ban. In the U.S., efforts to protect kids from gender medicine are progressing, as half of the United States has banned puberty blockers and transgender surgery to minors. Recently, in Ohio, after many hearings, a ban on puberty blockers was upheld in the courts. A similar bill in New Hampshire warns of the coercive context in which medicalization is typically presented. Medicalize your child or they will die. Don't believe those lies, okay? I and many others were surprised back in June when the White House announced it does not support surgeries for minors. That announcement contradicted the ongoing messaging from the Health and Human Services Secretary and pediatrician Admiral Richard, or you may know him as Rachel Levine, who claims affirmation averts suicide. Quoting, "We often say that gender-affirming care is health care. Gender-affirming care is mental health care. The gender-affirming care is literally suicide prevention care." Wrong. How wrong can she be? I call her she, theoretically there, okay? The seizing on gender medicine as a cure-all overlooks known harms. In fact, the FDA placed a warning on puberty blockers in 2022, Meanwhile, according to emails obtained as part of a recent lawsuit, an FDA official backed dangerous puberty blockers, and the agency withheld results of their own study and earlier research showing increased depression and suicidality. Medical societies have similarly come under the influence of trans activists. The American Academy of Pediatrics, in particular, is now an overtly political body. Early on, psychologist Dr. James Cantor definitively showed their 2018 policy institutionalizing affirm only as the model for treating gender distress, misrepresented the studies to justify medicalization as preventing suicide. Fear-based decision-making thereby eclipsed informed consent, since the American Academy of Pediatrics dismissed as outdated the successful standard of watchful waiting with ongoing exploratory therapy to address gender dysphoria. It took the ever-venerable American Academy of Pediatrics to relegate therapy to a non-option. Desistance, outgrowing your gender distress, was a commonplace for developmental psychology, well known to psychologists in the DSM-5 in 2013. Excuse me. Since then, gold standard research, 2 large studies over longer durations, underscores the best response is therapy. 2 nationwide long-term studies are of particular interest. Surveying a group of 2,772 kids every 3 years for 15 years, a Dutch study published last February reported diminished gender discontentedness of 64%. When discontent endured, the researchers discovered behavioral and emotional difficulties or same-sex attraction. Likewise, a recent German study found desistance rates from gender identity disorder were over half, with even higher 73% rates of desistance for teenage girls. Most kids outgrew gender discontent within 5 years. The American Academy of Pediatrics affirm-only approach impedes the kind of exploratory therapy that leads to this desistance. By contrast to watchful therapy, the American Academy of Pediatrics endorsement of medicalization places distressed adolescents at elevated risk. That's because adolescents are especially prone to the suicide scare. After increasingly exploring gender in high school, Christina Heinemann, for instance, was reportedly told by Planned Parenthood, the subject of her recent lawsuit, that surgery was, quote, the only way, unquote, to make, quote, crippling feelings of suicidal depression go away, unquote. According to another detransitioner, the industry is under huge pressure from the trans activist community to move things along quickly because of statistics around suicide. This frightened me into feeling I had to do everything as quickly as possible to avoid feeling that way. That's from a woman, now 26, who underwent double mastectomy and hormone therapy. Feeding such fears leads to more suicides. The United Kingdom's activist-oriented Good Law Project recently yelled that Britain's puberty blockers ban would, quote, kill trans children, unquote. We hear that around here in the United States, too. In response to the UK's chairman of the National Suicide Prevention Strategy Advisory Group, Professor Lewis Appleby, criticized the dead child rhetoric, since that represents a known risk for suicide. This may have been the case for Yaley, a 16-year-old removed from her home and started on testosterone, a psychoactive drug that causes emotional and mental health disturbances in women. Taken from the family home for wanting To transition against her parents' wishes, Child Protective Services placed her in a foster care system, and she was then prescribed testosterone without parental consent. 3 years later, becoming more depressed, she committed suicide. Accounts such as these show medicalization can be a death sentence for adolescents. Since affirm only has become a proxy for suicide prevention, the American Academy of Pediatrics needs to prove that affirm only produces measurable functional benefits. The kind of gate-crashing panic Christina Heinemann reports was fed by an over-reliance on self-reports soon after achieving surgical goals rather than analysis of long-term objective measures of mental health. Evolutionary biologist Colin Wright observes that rather than assessing double mastectomies within a rose-colored post-surgical haze, researchers need to chart objective measures of long-term improvement in anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and overall quality of life. Instead, the American Academy of Pediatrics relies on two sets of guidelines, namely WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, and the Endocrine Society. Both organizations built their recommendations on the weakest available evidence as judged by GRADE. GRADE is the Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluations, a transparent framework for developing and presenting summaries of evidence, and provides a systematic review approach for making clinical practice recommendations and multiple systematic reviews. The weakness of the guidelines becomes clear because gender is assumed to be the underlying cause of distress, and comorbidities are left unexplored and unresolved. Looking specifically at suicidality among adolescents and young adults, another major study concluded this year found, quote, this group's higher suicide rate was tied to the fact that they had a high rate of severe psychiatric problems, not to their gender distress, unquote. I must assume that the increased resistance of a public incredulous over pediatric mastectomies and even genital surgeries scheduled at leading children's hospitals, the American Academy of Pediatrics' more recent hedging reveals their need not to appear too obviously an engine of ideology-addled butchery. Walking back its affirm or die positioning, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics misled the public with reassurance that medicalization under their rubric was rare. Yeah, right. In an editorial for the Wall Street Journal, the American Academy of Pediatrics denied these surgeries even take place, such that articles were written solely to prove that, yes, they were, with new surgical wings rapidly being constructed to accommodate the 38-fold increase in mastectomies. Many expressed astonishment and opposition to genital surgeries being performed on healthy kids at major American children's hospitals. Recently, the American Academy of Pediatrics doubled down on its partisan transphobia rhetoric. It's hard to say those words together, okay? Transphobia rhetoric. In their publication, Pediatrics, a perspective piece argued gender medicine mitigates suicidal ideation so that not to affirm constitutes child abuse. In response, Dr. Kathleen McDevitt pointed out the authors cite a study unsupportive of the overzealous claim that affirm-only medicine, quote, entirely mitigates the increased risk of depression and suicidal ideation, unquote. Simultaneously, the American Academy of Pediatrics censored members who disagreed with the affirm-only rubric they had falsely represented as a consensus. As a result, pediatricians fear risking child maltreatment or suicide and losing their job. In this way, the affirmer suicide narrative can actually grow this dark spiral. In 2022, an affirming American Academy of Pediatrics member was called out for overstepping the group's own prohibition against glorifying suicide. The affirm-only medicine the American Academy of Pediatrics favors treats females as a male cohort, resulting in medical negligence. This is the premise of a lawsuit against the American Academy of Pediatrics and Dr. Jason Rafferty. The affirm-only approach he authored for the American Academy of Pediatrics allegedly resulted in a lapse of medical oversight of his patient, Isabel Ayala. Prescribed testosterone at 14, Isabel's anxiety and depression worsened, resulting in a suicide attempt. According to medical records, Dr. Rafferty increased her dosage, neglecting to take into account her female physiology and documented comorbidities. Treating her as literally male-bodied, Rafferty prescribed very high doses of testosterone. Putting a female system on disproportionately high levels of testosterone, however, is extremely dangerous. Under the rubric Rafferty offered for the American Academy of Pediatrics, emotionally unstable girls like Isabel are being, in some cases, prescribed male adult doses. However, high testosterone levels in females experiencing mental health issues have been found to be predictive of suicide. Quoting, neglecting to treat a patient according to her female cohort thus represents a dangerous departure from sound medicine, according to endocrinologist Dr. Michael Laidlaw, because adolescents are prone to risk-taking and lack maturity. We believe that they should never be prescribed testosterone. The failure to correctly identify a patient as female goes beyond some small unethical breach. For instance, Megyn Kelly, a detransitioner, testified before the Ohio Senate that she similarly contemplated suicide, quote, after regretting a surgery doctors recommended to solve her gender dysphoria, unquote. Such testimony shows suicide increases following the surgical affirmation, which should, of course, not be the case according to the life-saving rhetoric of the American Association of Pediatrics. American Academy of Pediatrics, pardon me. Recent research shows gender-affirming surgeries lead to suicide attempts, not the other way around. Another 6-year California-wide study similarly analyzed psychiatric emergencies and found suicide doubled for males following genital surgeries. Both of these recent studies confirm earlier landmark long-term research drawing on 30 years of Swedish data, discovering a nearly 20% higher rate of overall mortality for trans-identified patients, including suicides. Commenting on this comprehensive long-term follow-up study, neuropsychologist Dr. Alan Hopewell noted that patients became discouraged by their persistent mental health issues following gender treatments. In Hopewell's opinion, suicide following surgery suggests mental illness is left unaddressed. Many were shocked to learn that Health and Human Services Secretary Levine pressured WPATH to remove age limits in their latest guidelines. Yet journalist Benjamin Ryan notes it was actually the American Academy of Pediatrics that forced age out. Court documents released as part of Alabama's defense of their efforts to safeguard children from high-risk gender medicine shows the American Academy of Pediatrics threatening to withdraw endorsement unless ages were excised. Instead, the Pediatricians Union recommends, quote, an individualized case-by-case basis with parental involvement and consent, unquote. The word individualized suggests the protocol comes with careful differential diagnosis. Screening is nominal, however, when suicide hovers like the sword of Damocles. The American Academy of Pediatrics backpedaling, similar to the White House withdrawing support for surgery on minors, reflects awareness of the public support bans such as that in Ohio and New Hampshire. Once highly regarded doctors, members of the American Academy of Pediatrics, are increasingly held to account for ignoring the suicide risk of prescribing testosterone to adolescent girls. Gender medicine is especially dangerous for kids. Youth generally are particularly vulnerable to consenting to a future of urinary tract infections and fistulas they did not envision. Fertility seems expendable to teens, while permanent loss of sensation or function is highly sensitive in highly sensitive areas of the body to a teen is inconceivable. Adolescents, most of whom have never experienced long-term illness or considered the difficulties faced by people who undergo surgeries with high complication rates, are among the most vulnerable groups when it comes to suicide. With a terrible rush to medicalize their condition via the macabre forces of a predatory gender industry, teens are funneled into a lucrative medical pipeline. As a result, many never come out alive. So at this point, I have run out of time again, but I thank you for joining me and ask that, if possible, please consider donating to this show to help offset the costs of my research. And you may do so via Cash App or Venmo to Ladena Bough. That's LADENABOUGH at either of those apps. Boy, I had a total lapse of mindset there. Anyway, I hope you'll tune in next week for Trials and Triumphs. And in the meantime, I ask that you all be blessed. And if you're thinking about transitioning your kids, please don't. You know, this live son, dead daughter is all a lie. And, you know, your child is more likely to commit suicide after transition. Remember that, please. Have a blessed week, and I'll see you again next week. Goodbye.
To contact Trials and Triumphs, you can email Pastor Ladena Bough at trialsandtriumphs2@gmail.com. For more information, find Trials and Triumphs on Facebook and her podcast on Buzzsprout, as well as X under and Trials 56454